All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Breanne Tideman. I am a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. I'm based in Lacombe, Alberta. So if you've seen the map of Alberta, you'll usually see Calgary and Edmonton. I'm right smack dab in the middle of them. So very much in central Alberta and very much in canola country. So I get the pleasure of seeing these beautiful yellow fields every summer, which is one of my favorite times of year. And today I get to talk to you a little bit about weed control in canola. So my role with Ag Canada is a weed scientist, not that kind of weed. We're talking things like wild oat, cleavers, dandelion, things like that. So before I jump into the main bulk of the presentation, I always just need to take a moment to thank my crew. I have a wonderful crew of 5 technicians that I work with. We bring on usually 3 to 4 summer students every year. They're the ones out on hands and knees actually counting the weeds or sampling the weeds for me. And I am very grateful for their time and their efforts on behalf of the program, as well as a massive thank you to all of the funding organizations that have funded research in my program from day one. Incredibly grateful for their support and for their recognition of weeds as a problem. So let's talk a little bit about canola. So one of the first questions I get is often, what is canola in comparison to rapeseed? So in Canada, when we talk about canola, we're primarily talking about Brassica napus. This is the triangular view with all the different Brassica species, if you're familiar with it. Don't really need to get into the details. Really, what I'm saying is we're primarily worried about Brassica napus. In the past, it used to be more of a mixture of Brassica rapa and Brassica napus. Now we've kind of shifted primarily to napus. We do also have some canola quality Brassica gensea as well, which is a mustard. Now, we really saw increased demand for rapeseed oil during World War II, which is sort of where our rapeseed acres started to increase. But then after the war, it was sort of trying to pivot and understand what else that oil could be used for. So canola quality, in order to meet the standard of canola quality, it's something called a double low. So we are looking for germplasm that has low erucic acid and low glucosinolates. If you only have one of those, you're not canola quality. You have to have that double low standard. There are a couple of like specialty oil type canola lines and things like that, but in general, this is what we're looking for. Now, once these were developed, they wanted to differentiate it from rapeseed because that oil quality was quite different. And so they gave it a new name. They called it canola. The double lows, the low erucic and low glucosinolates, were developed in Canada. And so canola actually comes from Canadian oil. Now, I've heard in the industry before that the La at the end of it actually stands for low acid. I've not seen that in the official history on, say, Canola Encyclopedia or in discussions with some of the industry folks. I do know it's Canadian oil, possibly a low acid at the end, but that's where canola comes from. For anyone who's really into like chemistry type things, this is the official definition of canola. You'll find this on things like the Canola Encyclopedia. So it includes seeds of the genus Brassica. So that's where we can have Napus, Rapa, and Gensea, all be canola quality. But the oil needs to contain less than 2% erucic acid in the fatty acid profile. And the solid components needs to have less than 30 micromoles of all of those glucosinolates that I'm not going to attempt to say just so that no one's laughing at me during the webinar, per gram of air dry oil-free solid. So again, it's a double low, low acid, low glucosinolate. So let's talk about the canola industry in Canada. If we look at sort of average acres, we're looking at a little over 22 million acres across Canada. So where is that canola being grown? We do have some acres in British Columbia. We have about 100,000 acres in BC. We've got 6.3 million acres in Alberta, 12 million acres in Saskatchewan, and 3.3 million acres in Manitoba. And then we also have 56,000 acres in Ontario. So really across a fairly wide swath of Canada, we do see growth of canola. Now, there are some key differences in the different regions. In the West, in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, we are growing spring canola. So we are seeding this typically in May. We are harvesting this in September, potentially into October. In Ontario, they are growing winter canola. So it was already seeded this fall. It will overwinter as a rosette. It will bolt in the spring and be harvested earlier in the summer. So they're growing the winter annual canola. The winter annual canola is more common in the US as well. Western Canada, really, really dominated by spring canola. There have been a number of efforts to grow winter canola in Western Canada. Lethbridge down here in southern Alberta has had some success. Where I am in Lacombe, it was pretty much failure every year that they tried it because of our winter. So there's been attempts, but we are really very firmly in the spring growth type. Now, there's some important differences between those two types that I'm going to talk about in terms of weed control in a bit. So we are also known for growing herbicide-tolerant canola. So I want to talk a little bit about what weed control looked like prior to herbicide tolerance. Now, these are actually slides that were put together by Neil Harker, who was my predecessor here in Lacombe, in the mid-1990s. So this is when herbicide tolerance was really being looked at and researched and talked about. Now, prior to herbicide tolerance, it was sort of a free product rolled together. That is what you sprayed in canola, and it was post-muster Lawntrel. Okay, so if you were growing canola pre-herbicide tolerance, you were spraying post-muster Lawntrel. Lawntrel, particularly if you had some of the more difficult perennials like Canada thistle. When the herbicide-tolerant varieties were first coming in, research was being done to look at how does this improve or change our weed control. So this is just a slide from one location. This was Scott, Saskatchewan in 1995, looking at the control of wild oat, wild mustard, cowcockle, and cleavers. So the pink line is control with post and muster. The blue line, the light teal line, and the green line are different herbicide-tolerant varieties. And what you can see is in a lot of cases, our weed control was increasing with those herbicide-tolerant varieties. In particular, you'll notice cowcockle and cleavers. We're going to come back to cleavers a few times. Cleavers was really showing no control with post and muster, and much improved control with the herbicide tolerances. Similarly, when we were looking at yields, we typically were seeing increases in yield with the herbicide tolerant treatment compared to the post-muster combination. Now, Edge was sort of in and around here as well. It's a pre-product, so a pre-emergent product that goes on. We did see some use of that. We still see use of that product as well. But really, one of the massive benefits to looking at herbicide-tolerant canola varieties was this increase in weed control. So let's talk a little bit about herbicide tolerance. We actually had a herbicide-tolerant variety registered as far back as 1984, which was OAC Triton, and it was tolerant to triazines, but there was a yield penalty associated with that tolerance, and so it didn't really catch on because of that yield penalty. 1995 was a transformative year for weed control in canola. That is when we had our first imidazolone-tolerant Brassica napus registered, so a group 2 herbicide tolerance, and that was developed through mutagenesis. We also saw our first glyphosate-tolerant Brassica napus registered, which was through a transgene, and we saw 2 glufosinate-tolerant Brassica napus registered, also transgenic. So all of a sudden in 1995, we've got 4 herbicide-tolerant varieties, 3 different types of herbicide tolerances, and weed control is improved in all of them. So this was a really exciting year for us. Other herbicide tolerance, in 1999, we did see bromoxynil-resistant cultivars developed. I'll show you a slide in just a second that those didn't really catch on either. The other thing I just wanted to mention was that in 1989, we had our first Brassica napus hybrid variety developed. Hybrids currently dominate the market for spring canola in Western Canada. And that's really what we're growing. It's a complete domination of hybrids in our market. So just as another sort of something interesting about the genetics of our canola, we are growing hybrids. Now, having said this, the herbicide tolerant cultivars are in spring canola and only in spring canola. The winter canola, they are still very good friends with things like post. Okay, they are much more limited. They do not have herbicide tolerant genetics in those cultivars. Now, did producers like the herbicide-tolerant varieties? Well, it was introduced in 1995, and by 2005, 95% of our canola production was estimated to be herbicide resistant or herbicide tolerant. So most of that was glyphosate, glufosinate, or IMIs, although IMIs did decrease a little bit. Our Clearfield canola did decline a little bit. It tended to be primarily glyphosate and glufosinate tolerant. And you can see those bromoxynol cultivars. They were there for a little bit and then they kind of disappeared again. So those ones didn't really catch on, but the glyphosate, glufosinate, and the group 2 resistance, those got taken up very quickly and taken up very strongly by our producers. And that increase in weed control that I showed you, that resultant increase in yield, that's why. Okay, so let's talk about herbicide tolerance in Canada now. That last slide was from 2005. These are semi-current market shares. I did this work in 2020. And what I did was I looked at the crop insurance insured acres of the different varieties. So this is not capturing all canola growers for sure. They had to have been putting crop insurance on their acres, but it gives us at least a bit of a picture of what's happening. So in 2020, across the prairie provinces, we were seeing glyphosate tolerant varieties at about almost 30% of the market, glufosinate tolerant varieties at about 60% of the market, the group 2s at about 3%, and then about 8% were not specified. Now, I do want to point out this glyphosate plus glufosinate, that is a double stack, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but it was only about 0.5% of market share. A lot of these not specifieds were probably in this glyphosate category. I don't have proof of that. That's just sort of the general understanding, is that it's not quite this big of a gap between those traits. But again, you can see conventional is 0.06% of the market. So that herbicide tolerance is really dominating. Part of that is what's available and what's being developed in terms of varieties, but part of it still is just the much, much improved weed control. So as I mentioned, spring canola herbicide tolerance dominates the market. Winter canola has no herbicide tolerant varieties. I believe the variety that they're primarily growing is Mercedes. I wasn't able to get in touch with some of my Ontario colleagues before I did this, but they only have essentially one winter canola variety that they are growing in Ontario, and it does not have herbicide tolerance. So again, they're not getting those benefits of that herbicide tolerant weed control improvement, but because it is a winter species, it does compete better with spring annuals than our spring canola does. So they'd get some competition benefit just from the growth habit as well. Now, again, I pulled a bit of a list from the Canola Encyclopedia. So the Canola Encyclopedia is a phenomenal resource for canola growers. It's developed by the Canola Council of Canada. It's available online. Fully recommend you check it out if you have interest in canola. They have their list on there of some of the most problematic weeds in canola. So sow thistles are problematic. Sow thistles include both annual and perennial. We often don't differentiate between them, which we probably should, because that growth habit does make a difference in terms of how we control them. But sow thistles are a problem in canola. Kochia. We're going to talk more about kochia, but kochia has been problematic in the southern prairies for a very long time, and some of its herbicide resistance traits are just adding to that. Cleavers, or Gallium spurium, false cleavers, very problematic. One of the challenges with cleavers, it's sticky and it climbs in the canola. So if the cleavers are still green when you're trying to go through and swath or harvest, it likes to wrap around things and cause a mess of the machinery. Second thing with cleavers is that the seed size is very similar in size to canola seed. And so if you get it in your harvested sample, it is really, really, really hard to get it out. Most cleaver seed have a lot of little hooks on them like Velcro. So when we're doing research on them, we're using things like felt and paint rollers and we can separate them. Farmers are not doing that so much. So trying to get those two separated can be a real pain in the butt. Canada thistle, perennial weed, can be a very competitive weed. Definitely an issue in canola. Wild oat in Canada is pretty much an issue in every crop. So it just kind of always makes the list. but definitely something that we're going to talk about in terms of why producers are using canola when they have wild oat issues. Volunteer canola, not so often that we talk about the crop itself being a weed in itself, but volunteer canola can be a substantial issue in canola growth or in canola production uh, because it helps maintain weed or diseases and insects in that field when you are rotating between crops. But we'll also see if you've had significant shattering in the previous year or in previous years and you have a heavy volunteer canola population. What happens when you have that many canola plants in an area is the canola plants end up fairly small and spindly, and we don't get that good, healthy branching, which is where we see a lot of yield and we see a lot of competition with other weeds. So the presence of that canola as a volunteer really kind of throws off your whole seeding rate and can cause some issues that way. Last one here, green foxtail. Again, a common weed in Western Canada, kind of shows up in a lot of our crops, but can provide challenges in canola as well. So none of these weeds are really surprising, I don't think, especially if you're a Western Canadian grower. Um, they're kind of our standard problems across everything. But some of them have sort of special reasons. I'm going to come back to kochia and cleavers in particular. So this is one of our recent prairie weed surveys. We are really, really lucky. Julia Leeson leads these surveys. She's from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Saskatoon. And every 5 years or so, we go out, or she goes out with her team, and we're surveying in our different crop fields. And it's a randomized survey, so we can get a really good feel of what weeds are actually showing up in there. So I pulled this table. This is from the 2017 survey in Alberta, specifically in canola fields, to see what was there that year. And so chickweed was the number one. Now in 2017, it was a phenomenal chickweed year, and chickweed was in everything. So wasn't surprised to see that there. Not typically super problematic. Wild buckwheat, another one like cleavers that can twine and wind and cause a lot of equipment issues. Wheat, so again, a volunteer just from our rotation. False cleavers showing up there. Lamb's quarters. Wild oats, as we talked about. Canola, there's our volunteer canola right there. Field horsetail, that's a fun one. That's kind of like an antique plant. It reproduces via spores, not flowers and seeds, and is a really hard one to control in anything. Volunteer barley, again related to crop rotation, and then Canada thistle. So again, some of those problematic ones to control are showing up here, and some of those other common ones as well. Now, one of the things that we've seen happen is use of canola as a cleanup crop. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here. So in Western Canada, like most other intensive production areas, we are seeing increases in herbicide-resistant weeds. Year over year, we are finding new biotypes of weeds that are resistant to herbicides and are more difficult to control. This is across all crops. Okay, this is not unique to canola. This is across all of our crops in our production system. How many resistant weeds are we talking about? I'm going to just quickly go through the prairie herbicide resistant weed survey results from 2019 to 2023. This is led by Dr. Charles Geddes of Ag Canada in Lethbridge. We surveyed 827 samples over that time frame. 72% of tested fields had a herbicide resistant weed in them, which is 70% of all the fields that we visited. You can see the total patch area and the total field area estimates that are affected by resistant weeds there. But what it comes down to is that we estimate it costs prairie farmers about $658 million per year because of herbicide resistant weeds. That's in lost yield. That's in changing up herbicide chemicals to more expensive chemicals, trying to manage them. It's got a significant cost impact. Okay. What weeds are we looking at? Well, with group 1 resistance, we're looking at wild oat and green foxtail, two that you'll recognize in the problematic weeds in the canola list. Wild oat also has combination group 1 and 2 resistance. And in group 2 resistance, we're looking at weeds like kochia, wild oat, sow thistle, cleavers. Again, all which were in that problematic weeds list. Okay, and you'll see a number of other broadleaf weeds with group 2 resistance as well. This is sort of how common they are across all fields. So wild oat is common. It's in almost 50% of our fields, with green foxtail less so. Kochia in about 30% with group 2 resistance, and group 2 resistance in wild oat about a quarter of our fields. So not over everything, but also not uncommon. Okay, it is causing issues for management, again, across also all crop types. So when we talk about herbicide resistance with grassy weeds, we're focused on group 1 resistance, group 2 resistance, combination group 1 and 2, and a three-way combination of group 1, 2, and 15. Broadleaf weeds, primarily group 2 resistance, some group 4 resistance in kochia and cleavers. If you're not a herbicide person, that's okay. The reason I'm giving those numbers is just to emphasize that there's a lot of different kinds of herbicides that these weeds are becoming resistant to. And what that means is with every additional group of resistance, you have fewer groups available to choose from that will actually still work. Okay, so we're seeing limited herbicide options as a result of this. One of the things that we've seen with canola, because we have the herbicide tolerance to glyphosate and glufosinate, those are typically non-selective herbicides, unless you've got a herbicide tolerant trait like we have in our canola. Canola is actually giving us diversity in the herbicide groups that we have available to use. So they're not in these super common resistance categories. Generally, our canola herbicides are typically quite effective, and we're going to talk about some exceptions. But what we're seeing is that when weeds are starting to build up in some of our other crops in rotation, producers are switching to canola to clean up those fields. We're going to go into our non-selectives and we're going to use that herbicide tolerance trait or herbicide resistance trait in our canola to clean up those weed issues, which is great when it works, and it often does. However, herbicide resistance is a game of numbers. So the more weeds that you're applying a herbicide on, the more likely you are to find that one unique individual that has the genetics that it can actually survive that herbicide application. And so what we're doing is these fields are getting weedier, and we're going to clean it up with glyphosate or glufosinate. We are applying glyphosate and glufosinate on much higher numbers of weeds because it's that cleanup idea. And what we're really doing is we're now turning up the selection pressure for resistance to glyphosate and glufosinate because we're spraying on so many more weeds. So as a weed scientist, this trend of, ooh, we're getting some weeds in here, we better rotate it into canola and clean it up, that is a concern for me. Now we have a lot of producers that they just have their rotation, which is wonderful. And canola is part of it, and it's part of their strategy, and that's great. What concerns me is seeing the use of canola when we're getting into trouble, like maybe we need to include a couple more years of canola here in our rotation and get this cleaned up. It's not a bad thing to clean up your weed numbers, but only doing it with a single herbicide strategy is where I get concerned. Now, glyphosate in particular is a bit of a concern because we're also using glyphosate in our pre-seed burn-offs and as pre-harvest applications. So in some cases, we're getting 3 to 4 applications of glyphosate per year on high weed densities and really turning up our selection pressure to that product, which we have seen in other regions that have used glyphosate more heavily than we have. Areas that have glyphosate resistant corn and soybean in rotation are dealing with a lot of glyphosate resistant weeds. That's not the situation we really want to be getting into. And so again, using it as that cleanup is a concern. But really what's happening is this is a long-term concern in large part from the weed scientist versus the short-term gain of we've got our weed pressures under control again and our crop yield is improved. And so it's that long-term perspective of what are we doing to those populations long-term versus what does it mean for my crop rotation in the next year or two. And so those are a little bit in conflict with that use pattern. Now, with our herbicide-resistant varieties, our herbicide-resistant cultivars, what's happened is that we've kind of lessened the concern around weeds in general. It's become a little bit of an easy button. If you're growing a glufosinate-tolerant cultivar, you're spraying glufosinate, maybe a tank mix partner, and you're moving on with your life. You don't have to think so much about what you're spraying in canola compared to other crops. The other issue is in canola, there's other more pressing issues for the canola producers that they are worried about. Um, some things like insect pests. Okay, they're dealing with flea beetles, they're dealing with cutworms, they're dealing with cabbage seed pod weevil, with the canola flower midge, okay, with berthas and diamondback moths. There's a lot of insects, and year to year we get insect outbreaks that are kind of taking some of the attention away from weeds because these are harder to deal with than the weeds. We got weeds, we got our herbicide tolerance, we're good to go. In the same vein, diseases. Diseases like clubroot, diseases like blackleg, diseases like verticillium stripe. These are all very current, very pressing issues that are driving cultivar selection. They are driving fungicide patterns. They are driving seed treatments. They are driving a lot of the decisions for canola producers. And when you're worried about the insects and the diseases, and you have an easy strategy for the weeds, you're going to use the easy strategy for the weeds. It's not a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just that weeds are not getting thought about as much in canola production as they maybe are in some other crops in rotation. Now, just because it is easier, again, we've kind of got our easy buttons depending on what cultivars we're growing, it doesn't mean there aren't still challenges. And I've alluded to this a couple of times. I want to talk a little bit about kochia. Um, Kochia is our most notable glyphosate-resistant weed in Western Canada. We have a lot of glyphosate-resistant kochia. About 80% of our kochia populations are resistant to glyphosate. So in canola production areas that have glyphosate-resistant kochia, they're obviously not going to be growing glyphosate-resistant canola because that glyphosate isn't going to control the kochia in that crop. So they're primarily having to switch to glufosinate-resistant cultivars. However, control of kochia with glufosinate can be a challenge. Kochia is a challenging weed itself. It is very hairy. It doesn't like to let herbicide droplets actually contact the cuticle because of those hairs. Kochia also grows quickly, and if kochia gets too large, it is difficult to control with glufosinate. Glufosinate is a contact herbicide, so you need high levels of water volume. If you're not using a high water volume, again, you're not going to get good coverage on this weed in particular because of its hairiness, and then we don't get a good kill. There's also effects of water quality on glufosinate and low humidity. So control can be challenging with glufosinate on kochia, but you don't really have that other option of the Roundup or the glyphosate anymore. So it's a bit of a challenging situation there. The other thing with kochia, this is some work that was done by Megan Van Koski and Charles Geddes, some Climax Dymex modeling looking at, okay, so based on 2012, where is sort of the kochia regions? And so in the Canadian prairies, you're going to notice it's really in the south, into central Saskatchewan, a little bit into central Manitoba, but really primarily the southern regions of the prairies. Now they did sort of a forward look at expected changes in weather, expected changes in climate, and that kochia area moved north in the modeling. And when they did this work, I think there was some skepticism from producers that saw this because those producers that farmed up here, like I've never seen kochia on my farm in my life. Like I'm not worried about it moving this far north. This is the iNaturalist map of where kochia has been found in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And you'll notice it's very far north in some cases. Lots around Edmonton, lots north of Edmonton, northern Saskatchewan, up into our Peace region. This particular picture on the right was sent to me by a producer north of Edmonton. So again, usual region is like not even up to me in central Alberta. It's more Calgary area. This is north of Edmonton in a field, in a producer's field. And this kind of notable green patch, it's all kochia. Okay, so this has moved substantially north and really into the heart of canola production. Our massive canola production is in our black soil zones, which is in this little bit more central northern. We have canola production in the south for sure, but we see higher yields and stuff up north, and now we're getting kochia there too. As I said, I live in an area that was not known for having kochia. These were all pictures taken this summer within the last couple weeks, and every one of these large bushes is kochia. And a thank you to one of my students who volunteered to serve as a scale marker compared to that kochia. It's large, it's happy, it's getting very problematic. These were two tumbleweeds that I chased across our research fields this spring, trying to stop them from dropping their seed all across our research fields. My colleague in Southern Alberta is pleased that I'll be joining him on kochia research soon. I am less pleased about this, and I know the producers in my area are less pleased about this whole situation as well. Now, there is a product called Certitude, topramazole and bromoxynil, that is getting used to help manage kochia in canola. It does work quite well. It works decently, and it takes some pressure off of those in-crop herbicides for management, which is all good. However, topramazole and bromoxynil, they're a group 6, group 27 combination. And what's happening is in our cereal crops, where we are dealing with group 2 resistant kochia, group 4 resistant kochia, as well as the glyphosate resistant kochia, with that group 4 resistance in cereals, we're seeing more use of group 627s. And we're starting to rely on them a little bit to help manage that kochia. And so we have to kind of look at how often are we using this group 6 and group 27 combination to manage kochia, because if we're not being careful with it, we'll soon be talking about group 6 or group 27 resistant kochia, which puts us in a whole new dilemma again. And it's kind of the pattern that we've seen with kochia is we have a new product and then we get resistance, and we have a new product and we get resistance. So just being aware of what herbicide groups are being used to manage this weed, how often we're using them, something we really need to be aware of. Switching weeds here, I want to talk a little bit about cleavers and quinclorac. So cleavers, or really it's false cleavers, we have gallium spurium, not gallium aperine. Glufosinate is not as strong on gallium spurium. It's not as good of a product on cleavers. So if you were a canola grower dealing with cleavers, you were more likely to use a glyphosate tolerant variety because glyphosate was more effective on that weed. Now, in about 2017, we had maximum residue limits be placed, which allowed us to trade our canola if it had been treated with quinclorac. Okay? Quinclorac is a group 4 product. It's very effective on cleavers, and it can be tank mixed with glufosinate. So what we were seeing was our growers in cleavers areas more frequently growing glufosinate tolerant varieties and adding quinclorac to help manage that cleaver species. The problem or red flag, again, from the weed scientist brain, is that quinclorac resistant false cleavers were discovered in the mid 1990s. Okay, so this is a biotype that we already have in Western Canada. Now, cleavers are a selfing plant. They don't cross-pollinate, they are selfing, and the gene that was providing resistance to quinclorac was a recessive gene, so it wasn't expected to move very quickly. But that was almost 30 years ago at this point. So chances are it's moved a little bit. And now we're using a lot more quinclorac and again, increasing selection pressure. So in a project that was funded by Western Grains Research Foundation and Alberta Canola, we have been screening cleavers populations for quinclorac survival. We no longer have this original resistant biotype, so we don't have a comparison to compare to. So we are just screening for suspicious populations right now, and then we'll do some confirmation later. Unfortunately, we are finding some that are looking a little suspicious. So in this picture, you can see these back trays, there's nothing green in them. They're all dead. And then this tray is not so dead, which is a concern. So again, we still have to do some confirmations on this, but just something again for producers to be aware of. Quinclorac's a great product. It does work great on cleavers, but we do already have some resistance to this product. So let's be scouting. Let's make sure it's actually working in your fields. Now, a recent addition to our herbicide tolerance lineup is our double stacked canola traits. So the first variety of these was registered in about 2019, and it's a stack of glufosinate and glyphosate tolerance in the same variety. So now instead of having to pick, you actually have varieties where you can use both of those non-selective herbicides in the same variety. Now, I did look at crop insurance acres for this past year. It looks to be about 2.5% of the market across the prairies. So if you go back to the 2020 data, it was about 1%, maybe a half a percent. I think it was a half a percent. And we're up to about 2.5%. So we're seeing some increase in adoption. We're not seeing that same mass adoption that we saw with those original tolerance traits. Some of that is going to be based on what else we're growing in rotation. Some of that is going to be based on what weeds we're dealing with. Some of that is going to be based on the germplasm that's available and the other traits in the germplasm that you're looking for. If you're a straight cut canola farmer and you're straight cutting all of your canola instead of swathing it or windrowing it, you might be far more interested in it having shatter tolerance than having access to both herbicide tolerances. So producer priorities are also coming into play here. Now, we do also have some challenges. One of our most common recommendations when we have limited in-crop herbicides is, well, let's use herbicide layering. Let's use a pre-emergent product with a residual to help out that in-crop product on our weeds. Unfortunately, with canola, we've got fairly limited options. Edge would be one of our really big ones, which is ethafluralin, if you're not as familiar with the trade name. But really, there's not a ton of options available for our producers, which again is just increasing that reliance on glufosinate and glyphosate in terms of our weed control. So seeing development of more pre-emergent products with residual in the canola industry would be beneficial in terms of our long-term weed management. Now, as a scientist, I am always focused on integrated weed management, so I needed to take a moment to at least talk about this. From an integrated weed management standpoint, one of our really important things is good agronomy. Okay, this is looking at things like our seeding rate, our seeding depth, our seeding speed, trying to make sure that we are getting that crop off to a good start because canola can be a very competitive crop as long as it's seeded in a way that it can be competitive. If you're putting it 3 inches deep and it's struggling to even break the surface, that's not going to be as competitive as a crop. Okay, so just those good basic agronomy decisions. Now, I referenced seeding rate. We've actually seen some pretty good results by increasing our seeding rate in canola to help manage weeds. However, I recognize that the seed input cost is often prohibitive to producers actually doing that. But in talking about seeding rate, we also want to be managing our other pests. And some of those pests are quite early season and they like to eat some of our canola seedlings. So if we are seeding canola so that we only have 1 or 2 plants per square foot, because it'll branch and it's great, it's a plastic plant, it'll be able to still yield well at a low rate like that. But then we have a flea beetle or a cutworm come in and eat 1 or 2 plants per square foot. Now we have no plants per square foot and we are out of plants. And there is no yield if you have no plants. So having a seeding rate in that recommended range of 4 to 7 plants per square foot means you can actually lose a plant and that canola will still recover and still yield. So think about your seeding rate. I know seed is expensive, but we don't want to cut it back too much because then there's just not many plants that have to get eaten before we have none. Crop rotation, again, my predecessor, Neil Harker, did some work showing that although we can grow canola on canola and it will yield, we get more yield if we actually take a break from the canola. So canola every third year was yielding about 7 bushels an acre more than growing it year after year after year. In some locations, that was closer to 12 to 15 bushels per acre. Okay, take a look at your crop rotation. We don't want to be one on top of the other, not only from yield, but from weeds building up, from disease building up, and from insect populations building up as well. I think all of the pest management specialists are pretty much aligned in don't grow it back to back. Please rotate your crops. Okay. Physical weed controller tillage. We don't do a lot of it in canola, if I'm being honest, especially in Western Canada, where we are primarily no-till or direct seeding. So this doesn't play a huge role, But again, there are options to look at this depending on what weeds you're dealing with. Biological controls, again, not a ton of them out there for some of our key weeds, but keeping an eye on what weeds you have in there, some of those perennials, um, there are some options out there for some of those perennial weeds. Last thing I just want to mention is there's actually been shown to be some benefits of weeding canola. So if you get through that critical period of weed control, which is typically early in canola, later on, allowing some weeds to be in there can actually reduce impact of other pests like root maggot. So the root maggot fly, it likes to circle, and it circles and lands 3 times. And it needs to land on canola each time for it to lay its eggs. So if it lands on a weed instead, then it doesn't lay its eggs. It moves and goes somewhere else to find other canola fields. So having a few weeds in there, we don't need it to be completely spotless, although we don't want a ton of weeds in there dropping their seeds either. So it's a bit of a balance there, but just being aware of what is your primary problem. Is it the weeds or do you have a root maggot issue? Can kind of change how you want to look at your weed control. Very quickly, I just want to talk very briefly about sort of some of these new weed management ideas. So things like impact mills or harvest weed seed control. So these are things like the integrated Harrington seed destructor, the seed terminator, the Tech Farm weed hog, or the Redicop seed control unit. These are mills that go on the back of the combine. They process your chaff so that the weeds coming out have been crushed and are not growing next year instead of broadcast seeding them. Alberta Canola, some of our other canola groups, some of our other funding groups have funded work in this area. We've seen impacts of producers adopting these in terms of managing their weeds. It would also help manage volunteers if you're throwing canola out the back, right? That would go through the chaff. So impact mills do look like a fairly promising weed control tool in Western Canada. Not seeing a ton of them yet because they're expensive. I get that, but they do look like they can provide a lot of benefit. Chaff lining, a lower cost form of harvest weed seed control, uh, less beneficial because what we're seeing is the chaff is actually kind of providing a bit of a blanket to the weed seeds and more of them are surviving the winter. So not so beneficial with that one. If you're interested, call me, we'll talk. Other sort of new weed management, things like electrical weeding, inter-row weeding, autonomous weeding. We're not seeing a lot of that in the canola space right now because we're narrow rows. We're typically 12 to 15 inch rows is sort of our widest row spacing. This type of thing is really more in horticulture and high value crops. But there's a lot of interest in it. And hopefully as these things mature, we'll start seeing them coming to some of our narrow row crops as well. Super quick summary. Weed control has been a significant challenge in canola, especially pre-herbicide resistant varieties. Those herbicide tolerant varieties or herbicide resistant varieties have greatly reduced that challenge, so much so that the weeds get overshadowed a little bit by the other pests. Canola is being used as a cleanup crop, and I'm concerned about herbicide resistance increasing our weed challenges again and increasing selection on some of our non-selective products. Again, because there has been a lot of other challenges, I'm concerned that this is going to sneak up a little bit and then surprise people when it gets to be a big challenge. I hope I'm wrong, and I'm here to help as we work through that, but it is a concern of mine as we move forward. Very last thing, thanks for taking the time to listen to this. It's much appreciated. If you want to talk to me, I'm pretty much on all the socials. This is also my username on Blue Sky if you're looking for me. My email address is there. And I'm always happy to chat about weeds if you have any questions. Thanks very much.